Hold on. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. So we're going to talk about prevalence. Oh, first thing, just remember on the read and review, I'm looking for 2 paragraphs, not like 3 sentences. Minimum of 5 sentences a paragraph, or at least something that is cohesive. So everyone, just a quick reminder to edit or review. Remember, don't use shorthand or other little acronyms unless they are speech acronyms in your read and review summaries. So just that was a quick little reminder. Okay, so hold on, can you guys see that? Somebody, hold on, I don't have all your pictures. Someone just say yes. Okay, good. All right. Yeah, because I can't see everybody. Yes, thank you. And the chat gives me an alert. Okay, so a couple different things, because again, us as speech pathologists, we like a million words that mean the same thing. So a couple different things. Aphasia, be familiar with that term. You'll hear it not just in this class, but in other classes. A TBI, so that's short for traumatic brain injury. Autism, autism spectrum disorder, stroke, and then speech language impairment. So we have speech language impairment, or in a school category, that's what we call it, SLI. So when you hear SLI, that's speech language impairment. Another term that's starting to show up in a lot of the literature is DLD, and that's developmental language delay. Usually we don't say speech language disorder. We will use that terminology, but we don't use SLD as the acronym for it, because that's usually where when we say SLD, we're usually referring to specific learning disability. Hold on.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Why was autism and autism spectrum disorder like 2 separate vocabulary words?
Okay, so when we talk, yeah, okay, so autism is kind of the general term, or usually we'll say, this particular so-and-so has autism. So we kind of use that, but really the official diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. So we have to remember there used to be some different categories of autism a couple years ago. It used to be, Asperger's, autism, and then pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So it used to be PDD-NOS, and you'll still see that on reports. You will still hear other professionals refer to those terms. But now, when did it change? I think 2014, 15, when the DSM took out Asperger's and took out PDD-NOS. So we used to say autism kind of when we talked about what I would call, and sometimes I'll use it in quotation marks, traditional autism. Then we have Asperger's, which is a little bit different than what I still in my head now. In fact, I just had this conversation with another colleague at Midwestern, that I still think in that term. I think of like Asperger's, autism, and then PDD-NOS. And PDD-NOS, and what we're seeing now in day-to-day is, I think a lot of kids that have an autism label would fall under that category, where they have a couple characteristics of the spectrum, but not necessarily all of them, or on what I would call on more of the severe end of things. Maybe to me, PDD-NOS was like mild. Autism was kind of your traditional, what we think of autism, nonverbal, lots of sensory, lots of behaviors, kind of stereotype, for lack of a better word, or let's see, I got to come up with a better word than that. But basically, like I said, when I kind of think of autism, I still kind of think in that term, versus autism spectrum, that's what we used to call PDD-NOS and high Asperger's. So and there is a lot of literature that you'll see on that and how we're referring to our clients. So usually now we're just saying autism spectrum, ASD, or autism, whether they're quote unquote more of what are the traditional Asperger's, or maybe some people with some select categories of that PDD-NOS. But prevalence, so obviously, whoops, hold on, wrong. 1 second, let me stop the share and let me get to the right page. So, oh, that's right, I cannot minimize. I always forget that. Sorry, Zoom. 1 second. So I want to, so how do we determine, because so everyone can see this page on the read and review page. Okay, so a couple different things. There is information about a language eval. So we could have someone who has a different diagnosis. So we have somebody with cerebral palsy, let's say. So we have a client, they have cerebral palsy. Okay, that's kind of what we call like their primary. And now I want to look at their speech and language. I still will likely do a language test of varying difficulties. I will probably, if articulation is a concern, we would still look at articulation. So they could have a speech and language issue, although kind of their global diagnosis is cerebral palsy, but we still kind of evaluate that the same. We don't, obviously, if they have a disorder where they can't sit for a standardized test, but a lot of our clients can, whether they have Down syndrome, whether they have something like cerebral palsy or some other kind of genetic condition or autism. So we're usually evaluating it pretty much same. So it's not like I give a child with a diagnosis of autism something different than, say, I would maybe a different client with ADHD. So definitely adults, when we're doing evaluations for adults, obviously we look at what their primary is, and we kind of do some different types of testing for an adult who, in all fairness, we kind of consider them to been having typical speech and language skills. So it's a little bit different for an adult versus when we're looking at that developmental model, but language prevalence. So a couple different things. So the statistics are out, and honestly, I feel like it's just increasing. So just some things where we talk about 6 to 8 million people in the US have some form of language impairment. And I would say maybe even a little bit higher. I feel like that might be a low estimate. So anyone can acquire aphasia. So this is why I want to talk about aphasia real quick. So typically speaking, when we're talking about aphasia, we are referencing a client who's had, you know, your average typical language and cognitive development, but they've had some kind of incident, some kind of usually traumatic brain injury, and now they have aphasia. So now they have a language disorder after, you know, some basic trauma, basically is what happens. So you can get aphasia after a stroke, some type of traumatic brain injury, you know, anything that's done, aphasia after someone's had surgery on the brain. So definitely we see aphasia can occur to anyone, but it's usually after some kind of event, something pretty dramatic like a stroke, traumatic brain injury, something to that extent. So that's a language disorder, but it's different than our typical developmental model, our speech and language impairment, if you will. So I just wanted to make that point about aphasia. Aphasia, usually, for using that terminology, we are talking about someone who's now lost language skills, who, you know, for all intents and purposes, we think we're fairly typical, and then now they have a language disorder because of something. So that's kind of that difference than just your average speech and language impairment versus aphasia. So definitely, if you kind of look through this, lots of stuff. You'll kind of see some primary or specific language impairments. So when we use that term, we're talking about significant impairments of spoken language in the absence of sensory or neurodevelopmental disorders. So this is where it gets a little confusing. So this is why the new, the kind of, what's the word? This really relates more to your supervisor than to you guys. But basically, for instance, we have a client with autism. So they have a primary. It kind of implies speech and language issues of various levels. So from something high level like inferential language or pragmatic language, that's more of that social use of language. So we don't typically, we shouldn't be putting a speech and language impairment also as another category. They have language issues because the autism kind of implies it. You know, OHI, depending on what their OHI is, so that's other health impairment. So depending on what that primary health issue is, sometimes that implies speech and language disorders. Now, why is that important to you guys as a SLPA? So a couple different things. When you're working with a client that you just kind of know what their language levels are or what their language goals are, sometimes it's helpful for you guys as therapists to know what's their primary. Is there other things going on? Like, do they have a diagnosis of autism? Do they have a diagnosis of ADHD? Do they have some kind of other health thing going on that might be helpful when you're treating, when you are, your expectations of outcome of therapy, those kinds of things. So let's look at autism prevalence. So all of you should know, although, you know, I didn't check again. I still think it's 1 in 59, but I have to check and make sure that that's still the right number. Yeah, 1 in 59 is kind of the odds of autism. So definitely has increasing. And I do want to say that we've definitely seen some increase in that diagnosis, because also too, it's not just changing. So somebody asked, is it because they changed the DSM kind of definition of it? No, I think what we're doing a better job of as a world, as not just the US, but across the world, we're identifying those needs earlier, and kind of getting to the etiology of things sooner versus later for many of our clientele that we work with. So I definitely think that there's some changes with how we're diagnosing and identifying autism spectrum disorder. And really the other part I want to say is that autism occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. So it isn't, we could go to other places and see autism. It's not just a US phenomenon or a China phenomenon. It's across the world. And definitely we've seen across the global, all the research globally kind of also kind of confers these numbers for us. And really when you look in the United States, so this just always blows my mind. And it's hard for me to get a better, after 2010, they kind of started doing some of this research a little bit different, but technically you take 1 out of 6, 1 out of 6 children in the US have some type of developmental disability. So that could be speech and language to other more extravagant disabilities like cerebral palsy, autism, or intellectual disability. So definitely we've seen better diagnosis, identification, and then referrals at an earlier age. So the other part too that I think we have to remember when we talk about autism and autism spectrum disorder is that autism tends to occur often in people who have certain genetic or chromosomal conditions. So about 10% of those children with autism are also identified as having Down syndrome. So you'll see a lot of those co-diagnoses. Fragile X, which I don't think here in Arizona, we do a good job of kind of diagnosing that Fragile X syndrome. I do think in other parts of the country, they do a good job of looking at Fragile X versus autism. In certain states, you have to have a genetic test to get the autism label. Arizona is not one of them. I wish we were actually, because I think we miss a lot of genetic or other things by not doing that. So definitely some other more what I would call significant chromosomal abnormalities that look like autism. So other thing that really puts a person at risk is low birth weight. So birth weight is another thing that puts them at risk for autism. And also, you know, kids that are born to, you know, older parents. So, and I guess now the newer research is saying older dads specifically. So definitely some things there. You know, your older parent, like me, I had twins at 41. I don't recommend that on anybody. But so just so look at kind of the numbers. There are some other, when you look at some of the other numbers, you have to kind of weed out, when you're talking about developmental disabilities, developmental delays, a lot of children have a delay of some kind. Not every child meets every milestone, you know, in the time frame in a general sense. So those are just some things that we're as a nation, I think, keeping better stats on things. So that's kind of, can you expect, like I said, when you have 10 kids together, one of them's likely to have a speech and language issue. And then, you know, 1 in 6 are likely to have something else too. And definitely the prevalence is high. And I have to say that I think COVID in general in the past year has really impacted our really young kids in various ways. So for instance, perfect example, we have a group of kindergartners, and usually there's 1 or 2 referrals in kinder. I think we have like 6 or 7 right now. And that's only out of like totally 40 kids. So when you look at that percentage, and I do think all of them are going to qualify for services of some kind and likely need other outside services, that's, you know, that's about 20%. That's a high number. So looking at just, I think with COVID, kids were sheltered. Parents weren't going to the doctor for anything that, unless it was, you know, vital necessary. A couple parents I've experienced, hey, I really wanted to get a speech and language eval, but with COVID, it was virtual. My kid's 2.5. And I can't blame a parent for not wanting to do some of this stuff virtual, especially with young children. It's not, virtual is better than I expected now that I had done it now for a while, but for our very young clients, I think virtual is still challenging. It's more coaching with the parent on how to support their child, which is beneficial. That's not necessarily a negative thing, but when I look at direct treatment with the client, with our young, like, you know, and really I say young, I would say younger than 8, is a challenge. So just some things there. Okay, so be familiar with the prevalence. Definitely know the 1 in 59 number. Definitely kind of understand that what are the characteristics under autism. And the 2 things I want to say too. Okay, well, let me minimize 1 second. I'm going to go back to the read and review page. Hold on. I don't like it when I pull up something, it doesn't like me to go back on this. Hold on. Here we go. Somebody else sent me a message and asked this question, and I thought this was good for the whole group. So generally speaking, if we know a client has a speech and language disorder, if you as an SLPA are treating them, they've likely, and I say likely, I hope it happens 100% of the time, but every now and then it doesn't, especially how our Division of Developmental Disabilities work. Ideally, every child should have an evaluation, a current one, Sometimes they don't. So in general, doesn't matter what model you're in, regardless of, home health, clinic, school-based, hospital-based, technically speaking, your client should have an evaluation done by an SLP, because they're the ones that evaluation guides the goals and guides, the treatment plan. Now, if at any time you get a client who doesn't have a speech and language eval, definitely alert your supervisor. And typically speaking, when I say current, and I'm talking, and this is really mostly related to our child category. So under the age of, 18, the evaluations typically in a school base are good for 3 years. In, outpatient, you do a lot more assessment sooner to get your reauth. And with DDD, you should have one roughly, I would say every 2 years or so, we usually ask for a new evaluation. I don't want to get a kid that's like, let's say, like I had this happen. I got an 11-year-old and I had some great goals, and the SLP that was working with them was great. And then, I was going to be writing a treatment plan for my SLPA. And I did ask, his evaluation was like 4 or 5 years old. Now, yes, he had autism, but that doesn't necessarily matter per se. It's more about making sure, there's been some updated assessments done on the client to know, are these goals appropriate? Is this going the way it should be? So if you don't see a current evaluation, please alert your supervisor, because yes, ideally, and maybe your thoughts of what's current is different than what other places think is the standard. So definitely talk to your supervisor about that. So definitely here are some of the other things. So we talked about SLI, autism and autism spectrum disorder. So definitely, like I said, Asperger's or HFA is an outdated term. You'll hear DLD, the developmental language delay, receptive language delay, expressive language delay, and phonological disorder. So hopefully in 214, you guys have talked about phonological disorder. We're not talking about it too much, but, and then obviously diagnosis labels. So if you're not sure, please talk to your supervisor, especially when you have to do billing. This comes, obviously you guys aren't billing right now, and every billing system is a little bit different, but you have to have a diagnosis code in order to bill. So that's something you should be talking to your supervisor about. So adults, definitely, we'll treat people, like I said, this is really our adult. The acquired language disorder is someone who's acquired it later on in life after they've developed language. And that's really, and then pragmatic language disorder can occur for a variety of reasons. And sometimes it is secondary to other diseases. And so for instance, when we're working with someone like ALS, who they're having some debilitating things that are impacting their speech and language functioning, that's a different treatment plan than someone who's had aphasia and is recovering from an injury. So kind of that degenerative disease versus something that we hope we can progress, that treatment looks a little bit different. So that's kind of just important for you guys to understand. So when in doubt, and it is helpful for you guys as SLPAs to read the evaluations about how did your supervisor or whatever SLP that did the eval come up with what we're working on. Why did this SLP make these goals for me to do in therapy? So if you're not comfortable, familiar, or maybe understanding some of the reasons for the goals, these are all conversations you should have for your supervisor, as well as sometimes things we do in the developmental model can look the same or look completely different when we're working with someone who has an acquired language disorder. So for instance, I always tell my coworker, I talk about her all the time. So I really want her to work for Estrella so she could talk about me too to all of her classes. But her daughter had a brain tumor. So she was 17, an honor student, involved in all kinds of activities. And then she had this brain tumor out of nowhere. And she's had several she's had what now, 7, 8 surgeries. She's doing fine, and it wasn't cancerous, but it was just big and in a weird spot, a sensitive spot in her brain. And, she's had some aphasia, and she's been doing neurocognitive rehab. And my coworker and I, we talk a lot about it, and we come up with different ideas and things that, to do at home to support her daughter. And she was saying how interesting it is to see how she's regaining some of her previous skills. So, and then she was just talking to her current SLP about that. So these are things definitely, obviously she's her daughter, she's an SLP, so she understands some of these things, but she was talking to the other therapist, and, they were discussing about where her prior functioning was, and just trying to see how much do we push her? Is this where her max is, or do we push her more? Can she make more progress? And those are some things too that we don't have those conversations with maybe somebody who's in that developmental model. We know that maybe her brain can access these skills again because she had them before. So that retrieval of those skills is different than not ever having the skills to begin with, and we're building them. So that developmental model does look a little different than that acquired language issue for our clientele that we work with. So just make sure you're having those conversations with your supervisor. And sometimes it's hard to always know when you're working in a session if this is this the right target? Is this really what they're talking about with regards to the goal? Because honestly, a lot of the goals are written kind of goofy. So especially with how they want things done for accountability and measurability from an insurance standpoint, as well as clinic-based and Medicaid billing based. And honestly too, overall, the good part about all of this with prevalence is that we have good job security right now. So that's good. And I just think it's increasing, and that we have better diagnostics to find these issues. I think it's helping the clients, it's helping people get access to help sooner. So I feel that is just all in our in our favor as far as therapists go. So that's what's nice. So just know it is pretty prevalent. It's everywhere, and we're just diagnosing more each day. So that's good from a job prospect, as well as hopefully we're just going to see an increase of different places and different ways that you guys as SLPAs can be utilized. So any other questions before we sign off tonight?
I had a question about the observation.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Sorry, I don't know if you guys talked about it already. I just got on.
No.
On the first question, sorry, let me open it.
That's
real
okay.
quick.
I'll open it too. I have my desktop up here too. So is
Yes,
it all
says,
go ahead. Go ahead.
What did you notice about the session? How was her demeanor, vocal tone? Is that referring to the therapist?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So when you guys watch these, yes, thank you for bringing that up. And I didn't check. I usually check before the semester starts to make sure this is still one that's available on Master Clinician. They take stuff off and put them, we don't always get them back. What we're looking for, what I want you guys to notice is not just what the client's doing, is how is the therapist responding? How is the therapist directing the session? What are some of the prompts or cues that they give the client? I just kind of want you to kind of watch more of the therapist, and then how the therapist responds after the client responds. So a lot of therapy, kind of when I say the art of therapy, there's other people who don't like that term, but I think therapy is kind of more of an art form versus an exact science. And the way I do things is different than a coworker but we're both therapists. We just kind of have different ways of doing things. And definitely as a therapist, you grow and kind of maybe trying some different strategies or trying some different things that maybe is a little bit outside your wheelhouse too. And that helps you become just a better therapist. So the more things you are aware of or more you watch other therapists, the more ideas you get on how to conduct a session or what are some things that you could do if you have a client that's similar. Although I think a lot of the clients on Master Clinician are pretty, I would say pretty cooperative and pretty, you know, they can give back and forth for the most part. So really just kind of learning those techniques for you guys. So that's really what I always want you guys paying attention to is how is the therapist responding? What are they doing to cue the client? What are some things they might change or adjust in the middle of a session? Because that's the other part. You could have the best session plan known to man, but it doesn't go the way you want it. And it doesn't matter how many years of experience you have, that can happen at any given time. It doesn't matter, you can have everything planned out and then stuff happens that you have to adjust and change within the session. So that's kind of how I kind of want you to just get some of those skills. And when you guys go and do your hours, hopefully, you know, you'll have your supervising, but hopefully they can expose you to some other therapists and you guys get kind of a good variety of different styles. So I do like it when people are with me because I think my style and my coworker, her style are very, very, very different. But I think, you know, each of us working together, I think that helps us. And then we have a lot of access to a lot of different therapists. And so I do try to give people some different variety to, hey, go spend a day with so-and-so up at the high school, or hey, go see this at the real high need preschool versus more of like what I would call a 50-50 preschool where there's just children with 50%, only 50% of the population has delays versus, you know, 90%. That looks a little bit different in a preschool model too. So yeah, so pay attention. So yeah, usually my questions, if I am referring to the client, I'll put the client in the question. But I'm 95% of the time always referring to the therapist. But I might change some of that wording if that's been confusing. So okay, any other questions?
I just had a quick question about the quiz. Are we able to use a note card on this one?
No. If you can use a note card, I don't remember. This is 212. I think I let you. I don't know. I better not say. No. Usually no note cards on any of these quizzes unless it says in the directions.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. That was a good reminder too. All righty, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. And you guys have a good night.